And in documentary too, the editor really is the co-director, in my opinion, because there isn't a script necessarily. There isn't anything written. You're working with like raw footage oftentimes from real life, or you're working from interviews, so I feel like the role of the editor in documentary is even that much more stepped up. And I enjoyed that part of it, which led me eventually to segue into directing. I was like kind of doing it anyway, sort of, like feeling like that there's, it was closer, to and easier to kind of do from the vantage point of having been an editor in documentary.
Let's Shoot with Pete Chatmon is a podcast on directing for anybody that's quite simply ever watched anything. Pete converses with a wide range of fellow directors, writers, actors, showrunners, producers, executives, and more on a journey to determine just what makes a good director and why we'll always need stories. The Director is Pete Chatmon's digital studio, built on the pillars of craftsmanship that ensure a unique vision. I'm talking about story, innovation, perspective. Learn more about The Director, and better yet, get your official Director's Chair wear by visiting www.drctr.video. That's drctr.video.
Welcome to episode 32 of Let's Shoot with Pete Chatmon. Our guest today is the talented editor, director, storyteller, former animator, Geeta Gandbhir. Most recently, she was the executive producer and a director on Black and Missing on HBO with Soledad O'Brien Productions. Got to give a shout out to our producer, Tristan Nash, for tapping Geeta on the shoulder and locking her in for this interview. We have a really good conversation that we'll get to in a minute. But first, as always, I will give you the little update on where we are in the week. And a little bit of backstory too on Geeta. Back in 2005, when I was raising money for my feature Premium and looking for an editor, I had been introduced to Geeta by Mr. Sam Pollard, who is he's an editor, director, really awesome filmmaker, faculty at NYU, mentor. And while I was hoping he'd be able to cut the film, the man is probably one of the more busy working storytellers that you'll find in the game. And so he introduced me to a handful of other editors, Geeta included. We chatted, weren't able to work it out with the timing, but always look forward to working with her one day, which we do talk about at the end of this interview. But we'll get to that in a minute. In the other news, we just completed week 1 of prep on Reasonable Doubt, episode 102, which I'm directing. So we've been casting, we've been doing location scouts, we did the tech scout already. We have a 8-day prep, a little bit longer than normal for a 9-day shoot. 7 of those days are out on location. So we're really going to continue solidifying the look and feel of the show in this episode. And after I roll into production, the first director will start, Nima Barnett, who I'm looking forward to working with. And then I'll get to roll around with her where I can and get into that producer-director bag like Dan Adias and I talked about, and Michael Spiller, and a couple guests coming up. We'll have that same chat. Jeff Bird, who's producing director on Our Kind of People, and Crystal Roberson, producing director on Queens. So as you can tell, y'all get what I'm looking for here. I was looking to talk to people who could prepare me for the job ahead of me. And so we chat and I bring it to you. So it really is about sitting down and enjoying a little bit of time with folks, over coffee, beer, or the internet, Zoom, sharing war stories and supporting each other. Other than that, nothing much to report that is new. So we will get into episode 32 of Let's Shoot with Pete Chatmon, starring editor, director, executive producer and director of HBO's Black and Missing, Geeta Gandbhir.
Roll sound. Speed.
The interview. Take one.
Action. What, in your opinion, makes a good story?
So I think a good story, from what I understand, there's a couple elements, and just also from my work in film, I think a good story needs to have a proper beginning, middle, and end. I like a structure. I mean, again, it can be 3 acts, it can be 5 acts, as we know, but there needs to be the feeling of a journey for the audience, that they've started with you in a certain place. They need to become attached to the characters, whoever they may be, and they need to feel that they're traveling with them to a destination. And whether or not they arrive is up to the director, obviously, but I think that's important. I also think that the best stories have simple truths to them. There's simple truths and kind of that are universal, that we can all relate to, that really help an audience connect with. No matter how complicated the design of the storytelling, there has to be this underlying truth that allows folks to really, again, that connect to the people they are watching, or whatever they're watching. Maybe it's an animated character, but so I think that's really important. And then the other thing that I think is really critical for a good story is the telling of it, right? Like, it's how, because you can tell an amazing story in a way that does not engage the audience and that isn't emotional, or it's the connection. It's the ability to connect emotionally with the audience, and that also makes for a good story. I have to say, I watched some films recently where I'm like, ugh, like I get that the story is meant to be good, but if it's not told the right way, you lose that connection.
Yeah. I think about all my years working in administrative positions, and one job was literally by the water cooler, and it would be interesting to watch. I would just kind of listen to people talk while at the water cooler, and someone with something heart-wrenching and dramatic would bore the whatever out of somebody, and then someone talking about a mundane thing with like a style and knowing how to hit the punchlines and whatever would keep somebody there for a whole cup of coffee. Yeah, and that's right. That's the job of the storyteller. You mentioned a 3-act or a 5-act, and actually why would a film or a story be structured in 5 acts versus 3?
I think that's the 5-act thing is sort of, goes back to the old, the old kind of traditional styles of storytelling. Like there's, I don't know if you took like literature, at some point, but there is a 5-act structure to that at least I learned about. And I don't think it's so popular today, it's too long, frankly, when everybody's looking at TikTok, like you can't even get through 3-second structure. So, but for like more complex storytelling, right? Like that was an option, like the Iliad, the Odyssey, et cetera, those types of things, like and that's what I remember. But I obviously the 3-act structure is definitely the most popular and the easiest.
Right. And it's funny too how it's so timely, because now I don't have terms for what I'm talking about, but it seems like as of, I don't know, the last decade or so, at least in narrative pieces, and maybe in doc as well, there's this, let's introduce you to the world almost 75-80% into the story, and then we're going to go back to the beginning, travel back to that point, and then pivot toward the conclusion of it.
That's right. The starting or the bookending, right? The sort of bookending of stuff, like starting at the end and then returning, and then showing us how we got there, or starting in the middle and showing us how we got there. Yeah, those are all sort of tactics, but those stories still usually they have a traditional, there's still a 3 act structure,
Right.
where like the beginning, no matter what it is your introduction, the middle is your conflict, your catharsis, and then the resolve is after that. And that was the other thing that I wanted to say. A really good story also usually has some sort of conflict. The best stories have conflict, which is why we love, superhero films, and which is why we, you know what I mean? Like there's always an obstacle that the protagonist has to overcome, and if there's nothing to overcome, it's a little dull, like if there's nothing to achieve, you're like, what are we doing here? Like, why are we watching this?
So what's the first story? This is kind of a two-part question that you remember having an impact on you, like a visceral impact. And when did you decide that you wanted to get into this world of telling stories?
Sure. So the first story, and this is kind of a bizarre example that I ever, that as a small child that had an impact on me was actually the story of Robin Hood. So, and I saw, I think, the Disney version of it, which was like, they made him into a fox, and the characters were animals, but the story of what he was trying to do, even at the age that I was, whenever I saw it, it was, it was definitely in some early elementary school, like resonated with me so much, the idea of this person who was about social justice, like even though he was a fox, who was like robbing the rich to help the poor, that sort of concept really struck me. And I think that idea of that kind of hero also, there weren't many women in those kind of roles that were prevalent in media. And then I think I remember there was a show in the 70s, when I was young, there was the Bionic Woman and Mighty Isis, and the Isis in particular, the one about that person. I think it was on for like a season. I don't know what happened to it, but that show I remember because there was actually a BIPOC person in that role. Like that to me was thrilling. So those are sort of the stories that as silly as they are, that were on media, that were media related, that were the first ones that really struck me as being like interesting and powerful, because there was a clear hero or there was a shiro, you know what I mean? And they were, again, always trying to help people, always something to overcome. And so that to me was really interesting and exciting. And then ever since I was young, I had a lot of siblings. I grew up in a joint family with a lot of siblings and cousins, and who I was always bossing around. Like we would always put on plays, and I would always make them put on plays, which I think after a while they were done with. But so I think even from that young age, there was some, like I was trying to create like stage something or like make a show out of something, and so we would, that was the way that we played. And then it sort of in real life, I got into animation. I worked for Spike Lee for many years. He was really a mentor. Spike Lee and Sam Pollard both kind of gave me my first chances in the industry. And then I was doing editing, which is all about structure and all about story, right? It's like who you hand everything to make the story thing, right? So I was doing that kind of work. And then, and then I segued into directing eventually. So, but yeah, and I love to read too. I was also an avid reader. So I think, reading, it's all about, good stories, being immersed in that.
And so from those first kind of plays with your family, you were like, I'm gonna pursue this as my education. I'm gonna
actually no, I didn't. And forgive me, I didn't mean to step on you, but I didn't do that. So in college, I actually studied, in high school, I was in theater, like I did theater. But I was more on the performance side. I would do whatever, local school play, the school plays or whatever. And then afterwards, when I went to college, I studied arts and cross-cultural, like meaning actual making of art. I studied art and cross-cultural, what was called at the time cross-cultural anthropology, which is bizarre, but anthropology and animation and, minor in Spanish. And so I did like a mix of things that made no sense. And then eventually it didn't add up to a job. And then afterwards, I was working actually in animation for about 6 months. And I ran into Spike, who was teaching at Harvard, and basically kind of stalked him around the campus because I was working at Harvard until he gave me an internship, and that's how I got work.
Was this pre-NYU teaching there, or was he teaching like a kind of special?
Yeah, he had just begun. It was, I think, or it was on Malcolm X. So my first film in the industry was Malcolm X because Spike hired me.
Wow, that's awesome. All right, so let's talk about what the editor does. Like how do you, when you I won't even set that up. I'll just let you answer. Like, what does the editor do?
What does the editor do? Okay, so in my experience, the editor to me, and having been one probably, is like one of the most important people on the team. The editor actually functions in documentary even more so, I think, as they're like a co-director, honestly, because they end up, you hand them all of the material that you think makes this good story, and they're the one who actually has to put the story together, and I think with, Sam actually told me something very wise once, which I remember and which stayed with me, but he said, film is only, like with a narrative film, it's really, there's the script. So it's like the script plus the vision of the team, the production team, then the editor, that's like how you make film. And also he said something else along with that, which was that there's always, like, you think you're making one film, but you end up with, there's really 3 different films in your process. Like there's the film you envision, or you script, or you research, if it's a documentary or a narrative, there's the film you shoot, and then there's the film you edit, and they're all like, they end up being different. Like it's never what you originally planned. And then the editor is sort of the editor to me is always the fixer, they're like the person you bring in at the end, who has to clean up everybody's mess, but also, has to make it sing. So
it's like that third stage is the reality check also, right? Because when you're writing, it's like, oh, it's so great, and once the actors act,
it'll all work. You're like, no.
Yeah. Then you shoot it, and you're like, well, okay, well, it's getting dark, but we'll fix it in post. And
we'll fix it in post. Yeah.
None of these takes are good, but Geeta will make it work.
Exactly. We'll fix it in post. No, I think the editor is also oftentimes, unfortunately, the naysayer, right? The editor gets like the unpopular, is sort of has the unpopular job of being the one who's like, this is all there is. We know that doesn't exist. You didn't shoot that. Like, why did you do it this way? So, editors get a bad rap for being that person.
What are I love the fact that you say they're like, editors are almost like an unsung, unheralded co-director, And I think about this quote, which I'll butcher, but it was from George Lucas. He talked about like being a filmmaker, you have to know something about literature, philosophy, architecture, music, like almost all of the arts, because at any given time, you're going to need them to enhance your story, and even just to tell it. And so, like, is there a comparable kind of mastery of many trades required to be a good editor?
So I think a good editor needs a sense of, what's interesting is there's a math. I think good editors understand math, like they understand rhythm. They understand music, and all of those things require math. Like music is about timing and rhythm, right? And pacing and beats, and good editors know all of that stuff. They understand. Good editors too. I find the best editors are incredibly empathetic. Like they have, even if they don't display, like they have the ability to read emotion and, body language, and to imagine something there's almost like a clairvoyance to editing, where you're like, you have to be able to constantly anticipate the audience's gaze, and what they would see and what they would feel, even more importantly, by how you put some things, a scene together or a montage, or, and and that is really like, those things are, I think, incredibly, they're rare. Like, not anybody can sit down at a keyboard, now, and which is, I think, what's been amazing about the digital revolution that happened years ago for our industry and all industries is it was the great equalizer. Like, before that, to be in film at all was so expensive, it was so challenging. Like, when I started, and you had to actually shoot on film and get it developed and then get us steam back and God knows what else, like, all of that was impossible. And now we have, the iPhone, like, you can make a film on this, like, I can edit on this, that's all actually, I think, amazing. That's genius. But I do think, so anyone can do it, but it doesn't mean that you have this sort of I think the intuition that you can, maybe it can be cultivated, but I think oftentimes it's instinctual,
I totally agree. It's like, there's just a certain, when everyone working at their best probably can't really explain what they're doing, right? Yeah. Because it is instinctual. And, I think about like all the moving parts of like film is it's collaborative, but it's oftentimes like leaning on one piece of the puzzle more than on others. But like, I'm thinking of those moments where like, we got one take, we have to get this now. So like, actors got to kill it, cameras got to kill it, sounds got to kill it. Like, when that symphony comes together, it's like, you can't even, it's like you're in a zone, and you can't teach a good steady cam out when to pan. You can't teach a good editor like when to cut away. It's an instinctual thing.
And also the best take, right? Like, because so much of film acting is not is nuance, right? Like, the whole thing, if your theater acting is all projection, right? And then film acting, it's just about so often about the face, right? It's the facial expressions and so to be able to kind of sort of discern like this take versus that take, and which one actually reads as the most authentic to the emotion you're trying to convey, or to the scene, or to the response that the person would have is, that's like, again, you have to, even though I feel like editors are locked in a closet so much of the time, like they're like trapped, away from society, because, you're stuck editing. They still have to have this incredibly, nuanced understanding of the complexity of human nature and of the emotions that we have, and and how we react to things, and how we act and react. And that's again, not everybody has that,
Right. And you have to want to have that, because much of what people do to get through their day is avoid. Right. Yeah. And totally. And our job is to get to the place where we're showing the things that people want to brush under the rug or turn away from. Mm-hmm. Can you take me back to Malcolm X and working on that? Like, if you were coming from more of an animation background, now you're working on this film. What was it like? What were the differences? What were you learning? Sure. What was Geeta going through?
So I was very young. I was 21, I think. I had finished college, and I moved to New York. I had gone to school in New York, but not in the city itself. I'd gone to SUNY Purchase. And so I was very familiar with the city. I spent a lot of time there, as, as any kid, needed to have it, like, was searching for something to do. We would just go into the city every weekend, and had a lot of friends who, were attending the school from the city. But I moved back. I moved to Brooklyn. And after being, at Harvard, like in Boston for 6 months, I quickly moved back. I started, and Spike is actually the one who made the connection, I think, between animation and, and editing, like sequential art and editing. And he put me in the edit room. He put me in, he actually put me, first I was in sound editing because that's where I think there was a need. And then he shoved me after that into, I went into picture with Barry Brown, and Sam also worked on Malcolm X for a little bit. And Tula Goenko is actually the person, she's now a professor at Syracuse, who was instrumental. And she kind of took me under her wing along with a couple other, young people who were working there at the time. I think she thought I was totally lost, and I'm sure she was right. Like, she was just like, you don't know what you're doing. But she sort of taught me everything. She taught me, again, there was like the syncing of dailies at that time. Everything was on film. Like, we were using a splicer. Like, it was just so different than it is today. I mean, conceptually, we're doing the same thing, but it was very different, as far as there was a lot of physical labor involved, like in the editing, like the reels of film, and the hours were very long. And it was a lot of organizing. Like, I would sit with Barry or with Sam, and there were, we had trims, like pieces of the film to keep track of, and everything would just took so much longer. Like, that edit was, I think, a year and a half, like the whole production of the film, which is now seems bananas, like a 4-month edit is long, right, for anything. But it was the most incredible. It was hard, and but it was like the most glorious place to be at that time as a young BIPOC person, right? Like, you're like, I'm working for Spike Lee, I'm working for 40 Acres and a Mule. It felt like we were doing, to be there was to feel chosen. Like, we were doing this work that was so important. Malcolm X, obviously, being this, that movie was enormous. It got nominated for the Oscar. Like, it was just such an ambitious project, and I was so like. Everyone who was there, who was working for Spike at that time, was so incredibly proud. Like, we felt it was revolutionary, It was like, even though obviously there have been great filmmakers who came before, he had the company. It just, there was nothing quite like it at that time.
Right. And still, what was there a moment where you were like, in this narrative world, in terms of non-animation, if that's the way to phrase it, where you were like, okay, I just did this scene, or I put together this, sequence or whatever, and you looked at it and you're like, I got it. That's good. Like, I'm getting better. Like, is there a moment you remember where that happened?
Sure. So I worked with Spike and Sam on a number of things. And after that, like, I worked on a bunch of Spike's films, and Sam always let us cut. Like, Sam was, I think, one thing that I do think I was the last sort of to have this experience because of, everything going digital, but and computers sort of being the way after that. The one thing about that process, as time consuming and, long and tenuous as it was you would sit with the editor all day as the assistant. Like, I actually sat next to my editor, and that track, it was a training. You would watch them cut. If they were, if they were kind, they would talk to you, they would tell you what they were doing and why. And then, like, Sam would go to lunch and be like, finish this scene. And sometimes the first few times he did that, I think I tangled myself up in all the film, like the steam deck, to try to work the steam deck. Like, I think, like, I made a huge mess, and there was like Sam came back to like a snarl, of film. Right. I was like, oh, I'm sorry. But it was in that process, I remember being like, oh, shoot, I get it. Because he would critique. He'd come back and he'd be like, all right, let's see it. I'd play it, and he'd be like, okay, you should have done this, this, and that, or here's what, this is how, or, so there was this I was literally, back then there was the term apprentice editor, and it really was that, like, it was an apprenticeship where you were able to learn that way. So I don't know if I remember the scene, but I remember having that process. And I think that is how, it really made a difference to me. And I think on Bamboozled, I ended up with a associate editor credit at that time. And that was like a huge deal, after working for a long time.
That's an interesting mile marker, right? Because that was one of the earlier digital films, right? And if I remember correctly, what was it, 9 cameras on that shoot? Or it was
crazy. The cameras were sometimes in each other's way. Like, sometimes you're like, oh dear, like they were trying to, it was the idea, like the advent of this digital kind of revolution. And they would, suddenly everything was on video. So it was Spike, obviously liking to do things big, like a lot of, so there was, it was, I think Alan Kuras was, no, who shot that?
Yeah, I think it was Alan Kuras.
It was Alan, yeah. And so there's sometimes it was like, we were like, what can we do with the 5th camera? Because they were like, the 5th camera had like everybody else in the shot, what I mean? It had the whole crew, like it became, like it was funny, after a while. I think we used maybe up to 4 cameras, and then some of the other ones we were like, there was a scene, the mat with the Mau at the end where we finally I think used all of them, but there was some overkill there.
Well, I did a show, All Rise, a couple episodes where after COVID, they had 27 cameras available. And so, and only 3, let me not misspeak, maybe 2 operators. They were all remote driven. There was 1 operator who was in the A zone, right? So they could be a Steadicam operator and be near the cast. And then I think there was 1 more operator, but we'd shoot so many plates because we'd have to wipe out camera in post, and it was just like cameras everywhere. But it was challenging because you weren't able to accomplish much movement. So it was really like, how can you make the actors move to give some sense of fluidity while dealing with the fact that you don't want to have to wipe out 18 cameras, in your journey toward that. Totally. Did you know what did you notice in post? So you have 4 cameras.
It was so confusing. It was so confusing because we also were Spike was one of the last holdouts, if I remember correctly, to transition to AVID. He didn't necessarily want to transition to AVID. So we were, we'd been working on like a Steamback sort of a little bit past when other people had already gone to AVID. And I remember with all those cameras, like suddenly we had like 50,000 tapes and all these shuttle drives, like, and just, it was very challenging to keep track of, and then there were also different like formats, like, we had, I think mostly everything was on beta, like we were working on beta, but I just think in the edit, it was a little bit chaotic and, truth be told, Spike will be mad, but there was a point where I think we were just like, just forget it. Like, we were like, let's just ingest the A, B, C, D, E cameras and like everything else and just kind of, you know what I mean? And like, we'll catch up to that later because we couldn't, and then the AVID, in those days, like it was still kind of creaky and the timeline, like the layers of camera, like it feels like you can even see them, like, you need
like 4 monitors just to see the timeline.
Just to see the timeline, like stacked on top of each other. So it was, it became, there was a point where we were like, maybe this is, maybe some of this is silly, but it was, I mean, it was important exploration, right? It was just to see what you could do.
Right. That makes that. I have a question off of that, and you can make me smarter here. When I think so, from the assistant editor and editor, like when I've been on shows, I've shadowed other directors, assistant me, where there's like so many takes, and I'm like, wow, right? Like I don't forget why you're doing them, but they're being done. And then that goes to post. And there's, all 13, 14 takes, and 5 scenes from that day. And the editor's cut has to be put together. And I'm thinking specifically about television, but is the assistant editor looking through everything? Like if the script supervisor did not provide, print this, print that, this is the one. are they looking through everything, or are they just like, all right, I'm probably going to grab the last take, because typically that's where they settled on what they wanted to do, or you know what I mean? Like, how does it go down in those rooms?
So I have to say, when I was editing, I basically would screen, obviously. I used to screen like everything that was, that there was, and I would usually have the director selects, like circled, but the idea that it would be the assistant editor to me would be surprising, because I think like ultimately, I think the editor has to make that choice, or should make that choice of what looks best, the best one. So, but yeah, in my experience, the editor screens everything.
I wonder do you think there's a difference in TV with the speed?
No, not so much.
Yeah.
Like, I still think, even if you do 13 takes, depending on how long the scene is, it's not that hard to watch them. And sometimes too, I'll give you the trick of fast forwarding. Like, you can watch them on double speed, like which one feels the most, slow it down when you need to. But yeah, I still think it's 13 takes might seem like a lot, but it's, it's manageable. Because the scene is usually at best, like, how long is a scene? Like five, a couple minutes, right? So
in TV, you have, a bunch of 2-minute scenes. So I guess
so
in that regard, yeah. Well, this is comforting for me, because I often wonder.
Because you're feeling guilty. You're like,
or like you get stuff, and I'm wondering, like, what's really been chosen in this?
Yeah, exactly.
Hi, this is Dan Attias, and you're listening to Let's Shoot with Pete Chatmon.
Transitions, a director's journey and motivational handbook, is Pete Chatmon's book from Michael Weezy Productions. What started in 1993 has been a marathon of persistence and creative pivots, transitioning from indie filmmaker to teaching at NYU's acclaimed film school, to running a production company, to directing television and commercials, and ultimately eyeing a return to the feature films that gave him his start. A mixture of how-to, self-help, and inspiration, this book is for any person targeting a successful career in the creative arts. Transitions, a director's journey and motivational handbook from Michael Weezy Productions.
What was the transition from narrative to doc, which seemed to happen maybe sometime after Bamboozled?
So really, for me, it was 9/11. I think I was editing. I got into editing, and I found that, it was harder at that time, to get a job on like a fully paying narrative film was hard, because a lot of the established directors have their editor, right? Like, they don't want to necessarily, even though Spike was really generous, and so were Barry and Sam. So Spike, if he has the option, his lead editor is going to be one of them, right? Because they have a language. So, and, he had the money. So, like, why would he, it's like, I could always kind of be the second editor or something, but I wanted to like kind of be a full-fledged editor on my own. So I think I segued into doing some television. Then around 9/11, I remember a lot of the production work left New York, like the big productions that, that were also editing in New York, decided to shift back to LA or other places, because they were just worried that something was going to happen again and was going to shut down their production. So I was like, shit, like, well, what do I do? Like, there was, work just kind of shifted. And then there was the advent of like reality television and, and documentary, and documentaries had always been there, but it sort of was becoming more prevalent. I think, at first there were only two venues for documentary. There was PBS and then slowly HBO, but documentary, partly driven by reality television too, I think was seeing more of a resurgence. And so and I didn't want to move. I was like, I don't want to go to LA I didn't want to leave. And so staying in New York meant branching out. And that's sort of how I ended up getting into documentary. And then what's interesting is, Sam had started in documentary. So I had that model, of someone who had worked in that. And I actually, once I started working in it, I kind of got hooked. Like it was, the idea of like the truth being stranger than fiction. And then also I love the social justice aspect of it, like being able to tell stories that otherwise might not have a platform, that to me was really important, kind of getting being able to be a vehicle, to get stories out there felt like something worth doing, felt like it mattered, and you could be useful maybe is a big part of it too. So
it sounds like all of these things that that were important to you and that you had been developing and building an interest around and an expertise around were kind of put into a nice, gumbo in documentary where they all kind of got to be applied.
That's right. And then I was lucky enough to work with some great directors, and I worked with I've spent a lot of time working with the great Sheila Nevins at HBO and her team, the women under her. At that time, there was Sarah Bernstein, Jackie Glover, Nancy and Lisa, who now are, we're still at HBO. Even after Sheila is not there anymore. But I learned so much, and in documentary too, the editor really is the co-director, in my opinion, because there isn't a script necessarily. There isn't anything written. You're working with like raw footage oftentimes from real life, or you're working from interviews, so I feel like the role of the editor in documentary is even that much more stepped up. And I enjoyed that part of it, which led me eventually to segue into directing. So, because I was like kind of doing it anyway, sort of, like feeling like that there was, it was closer, and easier to kind of do from the vantage point of having been an editor in documentary.
I must say, like your innate muscle as an editor is reflected in your answers. Because many of your many of your answers they have an act structure and like a payoff, which is great. I could probably just ask one question and sit back.
Good.
Was there anything that you took from, or that you noticed from animation and narrative that you said, this is really useful in documentary?
Totally. No, absolutely. It's still it's still storytelling. So I think that's the main thing. I think I approach my films that I direct and edit now as if they were narrative. It's always character first, emotion first, you know what I mean? Because the truth is, with documentary film, the problem I've found with documentary is, even though I love it, is that a lot of times everything can feel like an advocacy piece. Like, you don't want your film to come off as some advocacy piece or like a promotional piece or like some sort of, it can be, you don't want to be like, if you don't want to go into lecture mode. Like people just, what I found is that when people feel that they're lectured, they feel dead inside, and then you lose them, So you really have to, I think I always think of my documentary films or try to, even if they are mostly interview, to keep them as character driven as possible, to keep, again, because that's what people relate to. And it's what differentiates it from news as well. So that's always, and whenever anybody brings me a topic, they're like, I want to make a film about, well, would you be willing to direct this film about X? I'm like, well, what's the story? Because the film about X is a topic,
Right.
What's the,
do you think,
where's the beginning? Where's the middle? Where's the end? What are we following?
Do you think that that's why it's so much more common now for documentaries to do what Michael Moore kind of was instrumental in introducing, which is like, it's a documentary, but like, roll with me.
Yeah,
right?
it's the first
And
person narrative, I think, right? Which he's sort of
yeah,
perfected. But I think but was it who was doing that beforehand? Forgive me. There are definitely documentary directors like Werner Herzog always kind of,
yeah, true,
does the narration from the first person. Like if you like
right,
was it Grizzly Man, or who did Grizzly Man? Is that Werner? But forgive me.
right. Oh, with the bear, yeah.
That like awful story about the guy and who the gentleman who was like living among the bears, right?
Right,
So Werner, so he's always in his films, or
right,
there is that. And Alex Gibney too, who's also a mentor, puts a narration in his films that is
right,
his perspective. um
right.
and I think I've always been a little bit anti-narration because I come from narrative and I'm like, oh, but I do think yes, absolutely. Like the putting yourself in it, or using yourself as
Hmm.
the foil makes things more accessible. Also, sometimes there isn't a character. There isn't like,
Right,
this is the other
right,
type. It depends on the type of film. Like the Michael Moore films, which are like advocacy films or specifically issue driven, there isn't one character that you're just, like a
right,
verite film that you're following around. So who do you latch onto? You latch onto him,
right. Yeah,
again, but
and
that's
it's all
the trick to give you a character to hold on to.
right, and it also feels like it's the gumbo of, you mentioned reality TV, you mentioned we talk about doc narratives, like all these different types of content now have made audiences more fluent
Correct.
and in different type of cinematic language. And so, and then the democratization of everything, it's like YouTube, MySpace, all these different things that it's kind of like we almost don't know if it is content if somebody's not walking us through the journey.
That's right. Well, it's funny, when you talk about like a MySpace, like we're like, we're dating ourselves. But the idea of really like now it's like really like TikTok and Snapchat, like the idea that everyone is a content creator, So, well, I think Michael Moore.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, Michael Moore was doing it he was just doing it early. Like his films are like
Right.
a TikTok, if you really think about it, where
Yeah.
you're following him through his world. But yeah, I think that, there's so many, again, interesting. I love the as you said, the democratization of the whole of media in the way. I think there's many things bad with it, but there's also like the fact that we all are completely addicted to our phones and can't like get away from them. And also the spread of misinformation, all of that is terrible. But the
Right.
idea
Right.
that the access that people have to tell their stories, I think that to me, like the fact that there's films like Tangerine that are made off an iPhone now that end up like that's cool. I mean, that would have
It's
never happened.
crazy.
And you know
It's
what I mean?
absolutely crazy. Yeah.
It's
So
revolutionary.
I want to get to Black and Missing, but I first want to talk about the transition or the impetus to directing. Like, what was it? And I'm being facetious here, but was it like I keep getting this horrible footage and I could do better, or like what was the thing that made you say I want to direct this thing? I want to have more of a hand in um, what is being put together to tell the story and not just be, in some cases, triage in the worst case, or, in the best case, complementing something that I might have added a different perspective to up front.
Sure. I think it's actually so simple. I think I actually just started to become, I found myself becoming like a really cranky, there's a sort of a stereotype that editors are cranky, and I feel like I saw it happening to me. Like I was like, oh no, I'm becoming that cranky editor who, I was impatient with my directors. Also too, I got older, and I think that suddenly I was working with directors who were, who were younger than me and less seasoned than I was. Like I'd done more films than they had. So
Right.
there was also a level of impatience where I was like, I'd be like, just give me the footage and get out of the way. Like, I'm just, let me make this film. And I was no longer being collaborative. And the collaborative part of filmmaking is actually something I love. And I found myself not like wanting that or not craving or being, and I felt like I was sort of shortchanging, some of the directors I was working with. Even though I would do a good job, I was like, mean. So then I was like, what's wrong with me? And I realized I think I was bored. Like I was just kind of like feeling like I had hit a wall. I was maybe burnt out around editing, and that I needed something new. And for me, I was like, okay, what will help me retain empathy for like, what's a job that will help me understand, which of these other I could produce, but I'm not a good producer. Honestly, I can do it. I shouldn't say that to everybody out there who's listening. I can absolutely do it. I'm not, but I just don't, it's not a passion for me, like I'm definitely more of a creative. So, directing, and also to model, here's me trying to model my life after Sam Pollard. So who does all of it. And I was like, directing, he's segued into directing from editing. And I was like, maybe that's organic stuff because it's creative. And boy, I have to say that doing that, like, do I have empathy now for the director? Like, I'm like, I feel like apologizing to every director I ever yelled at about like not getting the shot, or, why did you do this? Or like, why is this angle so terrible? Or why, what happened? How did you miss the moment?
Right,
like,
right. So it was, what I think, is important for people listening is that you're very self-aware, and reflective on like the type of artist you want to be and how to maintain that connection to the work. I think that's like huge because look, I hop around to a lot of TV shows, and I won't name any, but sometimes I'm just like amazed, like, you don't have to be here. You know what I mean? Like, why are you like this? You don't have to be here. You're getting a shit ton of money. It's a pretty great job, even if it's not where, like, let's just like, keep it in perspective. But if it's not what you want to do, and then making the pivot, which is not necessarily an easy pivot, like I salute you for staying on that path. To talk about Black and Missing, I watched it over the weekend, brilliantly put together. Such a, it's one of those things, like I'm cursing at the screen every episode just because of how fucked up, the institutions are here, and the racism and the lack of care and the depths to which people will go to maintain their position unearned in society. I could turn this into a whole nother podcast.
I'm with it. I'm here for it. Let me tell you, I'm here for it. If you want to go there, we can do it.
Yeah. But tell me how that came to be, because the last thing I'll say is, like, I love that there's like everything we talked about, all the like empathy, all the artistry and skill set that you developed. It felt like you were able to wrap that around this conversation and create something in 4 episodes that people can watch, be moved by as a story, be educated to as a citizen, and hopefully be given something that they can move forward and act upon. So like, how did that project come to be?
Well, thank you. I'm so, like, honestly, it's a huge honor that you watched it and that it resonated with you. It means so much, because I think I have, how it is when you've worked on something for a really long time and you're a nerd. Like, I feel like I have no perspective, like I know in my heart that it's powerful, and I know how important the topic is, and how important Derek and Natalie are, though, and Derek Butler, like Derek and Natalie Wilson and Derek Butler, just to say their full names, and how important Black and Missing is as an organization. But to be honest, it was one of the hardest projects I've ever worked on, and has made me rethink my whole life for a number of reasons. But but not because of any of the people in it, but because of the circumstances around it. So we we basically, so Soledad's company, Soledad O'Brien, who's like an amazing Black woman, right? I worked with her company on a film called Hungry to Learn. It was just a small project, but that was really powerful about college students and like the hunger issues that they face trying to make it through college, like food insecurity. And then this project was one that they had been developing, and they came to me and asked if I wanted to work on it, and I absolutely did. It was, I love the premise. I love the fact that it was about women. It was centered around these Black women who are, again, doing everything to uplift, protect their community and find missing BIPOC folks despite, right? It's like another story. And I think one of the reviews hit this. It's like yet another story of, Black women who always, it feels like, are the ones to be like, nobody's doing this. Screw it, I'll do it anyway. You know what I mean? I'll do it. Like, nobody's going to handle this. I'll do it, because nobody's paying attention. I'll manage this, which is this like incredibly unfair burden, but speaks to the sort of bravery and resilience, right, of Black women. And so I love the story. And it was really important to me to assemble a team that was reflective of the community. So, basically I was able to bring on 3 other women who are directors, who are Black women. So that was really that was amazing. We assembled a mostly BIPOC team. Again, I've been a big advocate around representation and inclusion and in our industry. So it just felt like, here's my chance to kind of model that. So I'm incredibly proud of the team that we put together. Everything, we were starting production, everything was going swimmingly, and then COVID hit like 6 weeks in. And so we had started in 2019, and we were supposed to kind of wrap it in a year and change. And so that was rough. Everything sort of shut down. We shut down for 6 months. We came back in September, and then we went back into shooting. And we were shooting mostly in the DMV area and like Baltimore, Virginia, DC. And then there was there was COVID. We kind of battled our way through COVID, which one of the 2 women, Derica contracted it and was very sick. And we were very frightened for a while over that. But there was the insurrection. Like, we were supposed to go shoot and there was the insurrection. Then we were supposed to go shoot and there were snowstorms. Then there was the cicada uprising or whatever happened. Right. So by the end of it, I was like, I'm gonna I think the team was, it just went on. It was so much harder to make because of all, everything around it. And again, the families and the women were so kind and generous, but it was a rough production. But we got through it. We're all closer now for it. I'm older, I've aged, but it was, and we put it out into the world. I also had, the team on this is everything. Like, I had incredible editors who were passionate and kind of also made the most out of what it was meant to be, a verite series. And because of COVID, we had to pivot. And so that also made it challenging,
Did you know it would be 4 episodes? Like, did you have a structure? And I guess also maybe if there's like the synopsis you'd share about the show, just for folks who will go watch it after this interview.
Yeah, sure. So Black and Missing, it was meant to be a 6-part verite series, which shifted because of COVID, but it is, the story of 2 women, Derica and Natalie Wilson, who are sisters-in-law, and they run this organization called Black and Missing, which focuses on finding and raising awareness around missing BIPOC people. And they are really this amazing duo who are doing so much with nothing. The organization is mostly them and volunteers. There's no one else, and they work full time. They raise their kids. They have families, and yet they're these tireless activists and advocates. And the story is sort of a combination of their lives and then the lives of the folks that they serve, who some of whom have missing loved ones, and all the systemic issues are interwoven in there as much as we could that lead to BIPOC people going missing at a higher rate and also remaining missing at a higher rate than anyone else.
Right.
So
Right. What I think was impressive also, and despite how just horrible the circumstances of everything that you're covering and that they do within the organization, there's a hope.
there's hope.
It was still hopeful. There's a hope, and there's still that like great wielding of storytelling techniques. Like I think was it at the end of episode 1, when the hammer kind of drops on, I'm sorry, remind me of the gentleman's name.
Derek Butler.
Of Derek, yeah. And then you kind of learn the story there. And then episode 2 kind of gets deeper into it. And you're just like, everybody with their own personal dramas still coming together to help the community. And it's a great film.
But it's
how, great series.
Forgive me. But I think what to me, as a person, as a BIPOC person, right? I'm like, this is what we always do. That's what we've always done. You know what I mean? It's like how we, like everything we do despite of white supremacy, right? Like we work through it, we work around it, we step over it. We basically, it's the fabric of our society, right? So here I'm making this a different podcast, but
love it.
But I just feel like this, and these women and the families and the communities are indicative of that. There's always hope. Like what was the quote around us? Like how we hold on to hope, like, because really there is no other choice. Like it's what has gotten, since the founding of America as the nation that it is, from the indigenous people, to, to everyone who's still here today, like the hope is sometimes all there is, it's really all there is. So I think, it's like hope and grit. And I think it's Vince Warren who says like, like they're just representative. This story is representative of Black folks and particularly Black women who just, everything is you do everything, everything is based on the spit and grit, right? Like are no resources. There are no systems put in place for us. We create them, making a way out of no way. Like that's just sort of, this story is really kind of, that's the heartbeat of it with these women, Do
you see, does the story continue? Do you expect to continue following them or doing any kind of follow-up?
I think there are many opportunities coming out of this for them, which is what we always wanted. Like we always wanted, there's a possibility, like there's conversations with the White House now. Like I feel like their position is changing in society. I really hope, permanently changes as far as the, what happens with the organization. So I think we have to see like where the story takes them and see if it makes what a follow-up might look like. But there's certainly chatter about it. They are popular. Yeah. Like I'll say that, they're popular and they're so like lovely, they're so like just kind of warm and, they're such like ordinary, again, what is the definition of a hero or a shero? It's ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Like they just embody that. And I think they're so inspiring that I could see people wanting more of them. I think we'll just have to see where they land up first.
Right. Awesome. Well, we're on the home stretch or in the home stretch now. This is where I fire a few questions at you as we head out. What's next for you?
So what's next for me? So I basically tried to spend like, since the series came out, some time just lying on my face because I was, I was tired. I was like, which I think is important to do in between projects, and then there's definitely a bunch of things bubbling for this year that I'm excited about, like that, none of them. One is one I can speak about, which is I'm working on a series for HBO. It's sort of the follow-up to Eyes on the Prize, like basically the next iteration of Eyes on the Prize, which is the seminal series about the civil rights movement. So I'm really excited about that. And that's with an amazing, it's with Don Porter's company, and there's an amazing sort of cohort of directors on that. So that's, I'm excited to be part of that. That's, out in the world and definitive. And then but for myself personally, what's interesting, I think partly because some of my experiences on this last thing I've been thinking about, I really would like to try returning to narrative for a little bit and see if, and you're in it, but segueing back into a lot of documentary directors are making that transition. So now I'm thinking about that because some of the things, honestly, with COVID, it was so terrifying, like to be working with people. Again, it's a journalistic endeavor, documentary, and you're often working with, at least I am in the films I do, with vulnerable communities, and I was like, this is, it was hard to wrangle, and it felt also, I was worried about putting people at risk the whole time to shoot with us, to tell their story. And there's also some stories that I'm really interested in that I don't have the capacity, there isn't a documentary there because it was never shot, and it's, what I mean? Like there's nothing there. So I'm actually exploring some like projects that would be a return to narrative, which I'm excited about.
Okay, that sounds amazing. The next question is, if we were to watch the story of your life, it's multi-tiered. What genre would it be? In particular, because we talked about this, would it be in 3 or in 5 acts? Who's directing it, and who stars as you?
It would be a satirical thriller. It would definitely be or either that or a comedy of errors, because I feel like so many things that have happened to me in my life have been like sort of a combination of incredible good luck and then just like I literally, like, meeting Spike Lee, which actually totally changed the trajectory of my life, was happenstance. Like I just stumbled into him on the campus, and in the most awkward way, so like that, I feel like is kind of the basis for much. So I feel like sort of so maybe a satirical comedic thriller. I'm trying to think who plays me. Oh my gosh. Tracy Ellis Ross plays me because she's funny.
Okay.
Yeah. And we have, when my sometimes we have similar hair when I actually like wash my hair and do something with it. I feel like she's, that feels realistic to me. And then was there a third part? Oh, is it a third? I think it's like, it's probably like a 10-part comedic series. You know what I mean? Like it's something like, it's in the line of like, what are some of the new series that are out there? Have you seen Sort of? Like that is actually a really, really funny Canadian series. Like it's like that.
Okay, I'll check it out.
Or the sex.
It sounds streaming. This is streaming.
It's streaming. It's like the sex lives of college girls and Sort of, and like all that sort of stuff.
And then, if it's a series, maybe who directs the pilot?
Who directs the what? I'm sorry.
Oh, who directs the pilot?
Maybe you there. Hey, how about that? You direct the pilot.
This is right up my alley. I've worked with Tracy 6 times. Exactly. Satirical comedy is in my wheelhouse. Let's go.
Yeah, totally.
The final question is, what 3 character traits do you think someone needs to make it in this industry?
So they definitely need courage, I would say. Like one is courage, like sort of courage and tenacity, right? Like those sort of go hand in hand. But I think because it's not, it's not easy. Like, and particularly when you're starting out, the hours are long, it's sort of thankless, et cetera, et cetera. There's like so much competition. You have to really believe, you have to be passionate about it. So, so maybe that's the second quality, passion. Like you have to love it. because if you don't love it, you'll hate it. I've definitely met some younger folks recently who are like, maybe this is not for me after their first job. They're like, this is too crazy. This is too hard. So I think the passion for it, but I also think and this is strange, and I didn't, but I also think the ability to be kind and collaborative is also really critical, because I have found that, like, the people that I admire the most in the industry, like Sam Pollard, who's like my mentor and colleague, and also like just one of my favorite people in the world, like is a really good friend. I think I've watched him be a resource to everybody. He's an incredible resource. He's so generous. He's so accessible, and just like a great human being also, but also very comfortable talking about his flaws, very comfortable, like still always learning, like someone who's still, even though he's at an age where he could just be like, no, I know it all, I've done it all, everybody else sit down. Is so engaged and always learning, and sort of love, and that spirit, I think just creates such a healthy, non-toxic culture for work and which I think is really, really important. And particularly, like, again, as a BIPOC person, who really is, thinking about wanting to reshape what, kind of the top, there's, our industry, like so many others, there is sort of a toxic foundation to it of patriarchy, white supremacy, exclusivity, et cetera, and really wanting to reshape that. I think, I look to sort of the kind of culture that a lot of young folks are bringing, to the table of, of collaboration, of inclusivity, of the, like, sort of the refusal to work in toxic spaces too, the rejection of that. And also of like hierarchy. To me, I feel like, and this is something I learned in anthropology, right? Which is a totally colonial exercise in itself. But some of the stuff I took was, some of the classes I took were about debunking that, right? Trying to, again, have a different methodology to it. But I think, in small societies where, people aren't agricultural, every single person in a community is important, because they're small, they're interdependent, and everybody's job matters. And if somebody doesn't do their job well, it is understood that the entire community suffers. So the idea is you uplift everyone, right? You see yourselves as part of the same team, and everybody matters, and everybody understands that. And so they do their job, whatever it is, even if it's like getting the water, or like, catching fish, or, no matter what the hierarchy, everyone feels included and important and invested. And I think that's the culture that I see sort of folks like Sam and other folks like starting to create. And that's really important to me as well.
Right. Because the byproduct of that also was more people, I feel that there are a lot of folks who have something to say that quit because it's been historically so difficult for BIPOC folks to get a foot in the door. And that means that perspectives that could be world-changing or world-affirming for people who look like them don't reach an audience because that person quit, and perhaps rightfully so, in year 12 of the journey. You know what I mean? And if folks can get there a little bit quicker, or know that it's going to be challenging and difficult, and have people, like you're talking about, like you had a kind of North Star of a type of career that you could model because of a Sam Pollard, it's all paying it forward to a point of more stories and people. Perception's reality. And the more narrative stuff and doc stuff that you get out there, it begins to change people's minds.
That's right. That's
So,
it.
well, we'll see. We'll just make something every day.
All right. Keep trying. That's
Um,
all we can do. Keep trying.
yeah, but this has been awesome. Thank you for taking the time. It's been a pleasure chatting with you, catching up, and I hope everybody checks out Black and Missing and all the other things that I'm going to outline in the credits and in the intro and outro. Check this stuff out because it's important and it's entertaining. So there you have it.
Thank you so much for having me, Pete.
What's up, people? This is Pete Chatmon. Follow me on Instagram and on Twitter via @PeteChatmon. Follow the pod on Facebook on our Let's Shoot with Pete Chatmon official page, and hit up our mailbag with questions, suggestions, or hey, donations if you're feeling like it via Let's Shoot with Pete Chatmon @gmail.com. And just in case you need to know how to spell it, that's Pete with the last name Chatmon. All right, folks, thanks for listening to Let's Shoot with Pete Chatmon. Next week, we've got the lovely Crystal C. Roberson, talented director, has just wrapped up as producing director on ABC's Queens. And she has directed shows like All American for CW, Greenleaf. We both we directed on Long, Slow Exhale, which will be coming out soon. And so we get down and have a really good conversation about her journey. So tune in next week. I might hop on Instagram. I keep saying it. It's been a little crazy, but I do want to give some book giveaways. So we'll get to that. And I also, before we head out, I want to give a shout out to Jasmine Jewett. I was talking to another director friend of mine, Angela Barnes, and Jasmine recognized my voice from the phone call. And I was very surprised to hear that she's a longtime listener of the pod, a owner of the book Transitions, and now an owner of some gear, thanks to Angela. I think she got the baseball shirt that says director. So appreciate the support. As always, y'all, stay safe, spread love, and keep creating. And I'll hit you next week. Peace.